Hello, everyone. This is Kim Richards with AHEAD. I am the operations coordinator here, and I would like to welcome everyone today to our webinar presented by Guild Education. Before we get started, just a very few housekeeping items. Our panelists are going to answer any of your questions at the end of their presentation. So if you can just be thinking of questions as they go through their information. And also we're gonna, and please use the Q&A feature to post those questions. We're gonna save the chat for any technical issues. And also Alex is gonna ask you to introduce yourself. So without any further ado, I am going to turn things over to Alex. Alex.
Thank you so much, Kim. Let me just screen share here. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Cannon with Guild Education's Learning Marketplace. I am so excited to be moderating this discussion today focused on serving working adult students with learning disabilities. Please feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, what institution, and we'll dive right in. This is a topic that is really very close to my heart. Some of the people that I love most in the world have learning disabilities. And I'm sure that's true for everyone here. As many of you likely already know, learning disabilities and attention differences are extremely common. 1 in 5 Americans are part of this group. And I'm also really proud to work for a company that cares about belonging. So for those who don't know, the mission at Guild Education is to help working adult students unlock economic and career mobility through education access. And the way that we do that is by working with innovative Fortune 1000 companies who provide education benefits for their employees, who we then help connect with academic institutions to help them attain the education and the skills that they need to unlock that opportunity. And some of our students have learning disabilities, also known as LD. And through our incredible coaching team, we learned that a lot of these students have faced lifelong stigma, and that has discouraged them from disclosing to their program or employer, and has really shaken their confidence. And that creates urgency for us. Urgency because as more employers offer education benefits to make degrees and credentials accessible to employees, academic institutions are going to be enrolling and serving more working adult learners who have learning disabilities. So it's important that we understand the unique needs now, and that we get on top of this and get it right. So to address that today, here's our agenda. I'm going to present some common education attainment barriers to you so we can unpack that a little bit and understand what working adult learners with learning disabilities are up against. We'll have a panel discussion with some incredible experts from higher education, the corporate world, and LD advocacy and research. And then we're going to leave time at the end, as Kim mentioned, toward the end of the hour, for you to ask any questions that you have for our panel, which you can and should feel free to go ahead and add to the QA function. Okay, so let's dive in. To start off, what are the common barriers that we're seeing for working adult learners with LD when it comes to education attainment? They're the same 5 barriers that many working adult students tend to face: cost, time, choice, doubt, and support. But in investigating this, we quickly realized that these barriers tend to be exacerbated for students with LD. And it's worth mentioning here that these barriers really aren't discrete. They play into each other, but we're going to look at each of them one by one so we have a good foundation when we move into our conversation with our panelists that will help us focus on understanding solutions and what's working, what can help. So first up is cost, affordability. There is a real mismatch between low earnings and high tuition costs. And when we think about students with learning disabilities, not everyone is a frontline worker. Some are executives. But when we think about the contingent of that student group that's going to face the most barriers related to costs, we're talking about frontline roles. So if you're an adult frontline worker, with or without a learning disability, and you're interested in going to school to get the skills that you need to advance within your company or career path, and your disposable income is limited or non-existent, generally one of 2 things will happen. 1, you're not going to pursue that education, or 2, you're going to take on debt in order to pursue it. And neither place is a good place to be. And that's one of the reasons why, from an equity standpoint, education benefits are really so critical. the same groups of people who tend to be underrepresented in C-suite roles tend to be overrepresented in lower paying roles that often, not always, but often lack upward mobility on their own. Broadly, many people with disabilities make less than $50,000 per year, according to the US Bureau of Labor and Statistics. So this is why it's right to challenge employers to underwrite the cost of education, because it helps create more equitable access to upward mobility. But let's say you're a Guild student, so cost really isn't an issue because your employer is already providing you with education benefits. The next problem we're going to run into is time. And this is a big deal for many working adult students with learning disabilities, because in the first place, we're looking at competing priorities, work schedules, caregiving. Half of working adult students are parents. If your child is learning remotely, you may be sharing a laptop, and that's yet another time constraint on when you can log in and learn. And if you're paid hourly, time is money. Those priorities that existed before school can get in the way of persisting. Case in point, the majority of working adult students who stop out of their programs say they had to do it for time-related reasons. So we already have time poverty or limited discretionary time that we can dedicate to learning. And for many students with learning disabilities or attention issues, it's common to run into challenges related to executive function, or EF, which refers to the set of cognitive processes that help us control goal-directed behaviors. It's a limited resource for everyone. I'm not an expert in this, but we did talk to one. We asked Dr. Rick Breich, who researches this and teaches at Landmark College, what are the most common ways that he's seeing executive function challenges present for students with learning disabilities. And he told us that those are related to the building blocks of executive function, which are working memory. So that can include difficulty remembering directions while working on a task or an assignment, inhibition, which can refer here to struggling to hold back or engage in a given action, and cognitive flexibility, which can include over-focusing, under-focusing, or difficulty with transition. And while to varying degrees, every person may encounter challenges with these EF building blocks, they are common challenges that people with learning disabilities encounter, according to the experts. And we're talking about this in the context of time because these students are already taxed. They're in situations where they have to context switch frequently or try to multitask. And that's not optimal anytime, and especially when a learning disability or attention difference is present, that can further exacerbate time poverty. And then there's the question of what program to enroll in. Employers with education benefits tend to think outside the box when it comes to skilling. They are willing to promote and make internal hires, and they think about career pathways. And as a result, their employees may feel greater clarity about the skills they need to advance. But today, because of the sheer number of options out there, if you're already struggling with time poverty, how are you going to parse what program is best for your needs? Working adults tend to self-pace, prefer to self-pace, and that means asynchronous learning, which often means online learning. And being able to learn at your own pace is great, but only if you have the right supports. If a student with a learning disability needs to access support in order to advance in a given lesson, how quickly and easily can they access it? And in what way will that support be delivered? You know, is there an option to talk to someone live and get the help that might be needed synchronously? That's a frequent question. And working adult students also sometimes feel like outsiders. For a student with a learning disability, that feeling may be even more acute. So what does the academic institution do to foster belonging? Many are not clear on their websites about any of the above. And that can add to confusion and stress about which program is really going to get a student with LD to where they need to be. And this slides right into one of the most prodigious and abjectly unfair challenges that a person with LD can face, which is the effect of stigma and misconceptions about learning disabilities that threaten to hold these working students back. Working adult students in general experience self-doubt and may have confidence wobbles related to logistical challenges and the fact that many students may have been out of school for 10, 15, 20 years. And they're wondering, can I really go back? Can I make it work? Students with LD think along these lines. And they also have to contend with folks who don't understand that learning disability has nothing to do with a person's intellect or IQ or motivation. A couple of years ago, the National Center for Learning Disabilities found that 33% of educators believe that what's called learning disability is actually just laziness. I have to say I've practiced this deck so many times, and that one never gets easier. Educators. And the upshot is this: 76% of students with LD don't tell their universities that they have a learning disability. And that carries implications around accommodation that might be beneficial or necessary, and access to support to learn the strategies that work best. And this is a trend that carries forward into the workplace. There's a similar pattern here. It's extremely difficult in the first place, I should say, to find reliable data about what people who have what's often referred to as invisible disabilities, such as learning disabilities, experience. Broadly, there's ample evidence that people with disabilities, both visible and invisible, do face bias in a variety of ways, resulting in the majority feeling stalled in their careers, according to the Harvard Business Review. And according to the Disability Equality Index, only 45% of companies are asking job candidates if they would need accommodation as part of their recruitment process. And when a company isn't doing that, that can be interpreted as a signal of a lack of commitment to accommodate and be an inclusive workplace that has a hiring strategy to equitably include people with disabilities. Qualitatively, at Guild, we do know that folks with learning disabilities who don't want to disclose often don't want to do so, not because of the learning disability that they have, but because of the fear of the bias they might encounter. And for many, it just feels like simply too much of a risk. And of course, that's to say nothing of belonging itself. In our panel, we'll talk more about this, but of course, disclosure alone does not comprise belonging. And lastly, the fifth barrier related to that is support. When we're looking at program choice, I mentioned that resources that academic institutions can provide to help students really take full advantage of their education and persist vary quite a bit, institution by institution. The students that tend to be at Guild, that tend to be more successful in terms of persistence have access to excellent wraparound supports. And those are supports like community. They can talk to peers who are going through this with them and get it. They have career coaching and advising that can help encourage that innate self-efficacy, so they can overcome obstacles. And they have the right institutional resources to help meet their individual learning needs. Similarly, in the workplace, that means a culture that normalizes disclosure. There's a plan for accommodation and a sense of creating inclusion and belonging, both through representation and through inclusion in groups where peers can come together and build community. So we have a lot of challenges before us in just these 5 barriers. Fortunately, there is a way up. The LD community consists of millions of hardworking, creative, capable people, and there are documented ways that we can do a better job of serving them as employers and as academic institutions and as people. And in turn, we can benefit from the talents and ideas that they have to offer. So in a moment, I'll turn it over to our amazing panelists. Before I do, if you're interested in learning more about Guild and getting in touch with us, we are going to drop a link into the chat. Please do feel free to reach out. We're always happy to connect. And now I will turn it over to our amazing panelists. So with us today, I'm very pleased to introduce Gabrielle Miller, who is the Executive Director of the SALT Center at the University of Arizona. SALT is an acronym for Strategic Alternative Learning Techniques. And the SALT Center is an academic support program that provides services to University of Arizona students with learning and attention challenges. Alicia Johnson, who is Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Centene Corporation, which is a diversified multinational healthcare enterprise committed to helping people live healthier lives. And Centene was also recognized by the Disability Equality Index as one of the best places to work for people with disabilities. And Sheldon Horowitz, who is Senior Advisor, Strategic Innovation, Research and Insights at the National Center for Learning Disabilities, also known as NCLD. NCLD is a field leader and awareness advocate on a national level for learning disability awareness, research, and innovation. So we are so lucky to be joined by these three individuals today. I'm going to stop my screen share so we can see your lovely faces. Hi. I thought that we might be able to start by addressing self-doubt, because this is such a big topic and really means talking about stigma and raising LD awareness and addressing bias. So Sheldon, I'd love to start with you. In your work with NCLD, you found that out of 100 students who have learning disabilities, on average, only 24 of them are going to disclose that to their universities, even though for many students, part of the secret sauce to academic success may include disclosure. It would appear that stigma is a big driver of that, but maybe not the only driver. Can you help us get a baseline and help us understand what's going on there?
Sure. Thank you, Alex. I wish I was a bird on your shoulder as you were going over the deck, because there's just so much richness in it and great data. I'm glad that you actually offered up some of what it is that I'm going to allude to and maybe add a little bit of meat on the bone. In terms of the issue of stigma and self-doubt, let me just begin by telling a little bit of a story. I want to raise some of the data in a way that some people may find helpful, but I think it's really telling. A couple of years ago, NCLD did a study called Student Voices, where we actually spoke to young adults themselves. We talked to young people, and we said about 1,200 or more, and we asked them to reflect on their experiences leaving high school, entering college, and then entering the workplace. Think back, and then think current. We asked about their grades, about their life activities, about their family, about their friends. We wanted to know which profile of a young adult would facilitate their being what we called a navigator, someone who was rocking and rolling and doing really well and sort of on a path to success, others who are copers, and then others who are strugglers, right? And what we looked for was, what are those key ingredients? Clearly, we were surprised. You would think that if someone was in special education, they received all kinds of services and supports, that would push them up into a navigator box. Well, that wasn't true. We also thought that maybe if they got tutoring or they were in therapy, again, didn't rise to the level of significance. More than 80% of the reason individual students, young adults, ended up in those navigator categories, in that highest, most proficient, prolific, category, had to do with three things. It had to do with the supportive life, home life or work life, having a trusted adult who believed in them and was willing unconditionally to provide them support, or at least explore options for support with them. Number two was connections to friends and family and community. And I would say that extends easily to the workplace. And the third was self-confidence, right? Those with the highest levels of self-confidence, which of course comes with success, those were the ones who were able to persevere. Those were the ones who were risk takers. Those are the ones who had opportunities for self-reflection and received the just-in-time feedback that they needed and the opportunities to self-correct. So if we know those things, if those are the firsthand data that individuals with learning disabilities are telling us, we need to respect those voices and messages and find ways, both in college and in the workplace, to provide opportunities to shape those experiences reflecting those particular drivers of success. Think about how those can be incorporated into performance reviews or discussed by supervisors or feedback in college and in the workplace. The other thing that's really interesting is if you think about all the students who have learning disabilities in high school, right? The numbers are about 38%. What happens is when you think about disclosure at college, the numbers drop to about 5%. I mean, it's just maddening to think that individuals are not disclosing because they've had all this practice and all of these services and supports. What is it, magic? You graduate from high school and you don't need it anymore? Well, that leads us to the question of why that's happening. And I think it has everything to do with stigma and shame, those S words. It's related to their fear of being discovered as being different. It's related to their not wanting to be compared with other people who don't disclose or who may not need services and supports. It's, that hidden unless the person is asked to do something that taps into their weakness as opposed to their strength. It has to do with that stigma and that shame that they feel without perhaps, without reason, because they haven't failed. They haven't really had experienced discrimination in the workplace. So what does it look like? Well, a person with dyslexia, for example, who may have a learning disability in reading, may do an incredible job at selling. But when you have to write up that report or that order and then follow a precise series of steps in terms of completing paperwork, that's where they crash and burn. Person with dyscalculia, which is a learning disability in math, they may excel in that higher level advanced problem solving in math, but in the calculation work, in the actual manipulation of numbers, they may be really slow and inefficient. And people would think, well, how can you do that advanced level work if you can't do basic calculations? But that's precisely the kind of ways that their disability manifests itself. And you mentioned executive function, person with ADHD, which is not a learning disability per se, but the overlap with LD and ADHD is just incredibly high. It may be that these people start a lot of activities and don't finish them, or they don't have, the good skills at planning ahead or adhering to deadlines. So the point is, how do we think about these folks with LD and or ADHD, and how do they feel when they hit this invisible wall with their most often invisible disability, right? So what do they do and what do you do in response? So it's important to remember that if you know one person with a learning disability, you know one person with a learning disability, because these are heterogeneous disorders. They are not one and the same in everybody. They manifest themselves differently in all different kinds of ways, but they're unique to the individual, unique to different settings, and unique to different challenges and circumstances. So those are the internal barriers. Those are the things that sort of keep people from inside out, not accessing the kinds of information, services, and supports they need. But as you mentioned, ableism is a real concern. And by that, I mean the presumption of a diminished capacity or capability just simply based on the label, right?
Right.
Think about the workplace. Colleges and workplaces, I mean, they're our reality, but they're not created with universal design for learning or features of the science of learning in mind. So for example, let's just take UDL, for example. If that's not a term you're familiar with, you should really, the people on the webinar, I'm sure, are familiar, but just as a reference, UDL is all about options, right? How do you engage? How do you minimize distractions in the ways that you select how it is that you like to be engaged? What about representation? You customizing the display you're working with. That's really easy in a lot of circumstances, but would you prefer information to be presented visually or auditorily? Right? Action and expression. How do you want to be able to respond to a request or present a project or share the result of some sort of an activity? Sustaining effort and persistence, the language, the symbols, the vocabulary, self-expression, what you need by way of background information to be able to succeed. These are all baked into the principles of UDL, which aren't expensive and they aren't hard, but they have to be intentional for them to work. And you need to be able to look at activities, at responsibilities, at job requirements, at learning, be it remote or in person, at opportunities to accelerate skill development, and say, are the principles of UDL baked into these opportunities? Because if they're not, what we're doing is we're dangling a carrot, but making it really hard for the person with a learning disability to access what we most want them to access. And then as a scientist, and my love and background is first and foremost in the neurosciences in education. If I had a slide deck, I would show a little picture of a brain and we would have arrows and networks. But people think about adults as having fully formed, complete neurological apparatus, and it's done. right? In young children, there's all this neural pruning and the brain is not developed well. And well, guess what? There are billions of neural pathways that provide significant potential for everybody to learn and thrive throughout their lifetime. Brains right up into adulthood are malleable, very plastic, right? Learning is never linear, it's always continuous. And experiences, the environments and the cultures, all of those things, those things that we facilitate by way of professional development or ongoing opportunities for higher education, all of those things contribute to the way the brain functions in adulthood, and they buffer all the bad stuff. They actually can buffer the negative effects and challenges, even trauma, we know, even getting fired from a job and not working for a couple of years, or having gone through multiple demotions, or not being promoted even though other people around you are. Those relationships can actually, positive relationships, can actually, in a neurological kind of a way, buffer the effects and the challenges that people experience. So the bottom line is we know a lot about what works, how the brain works, how we should be using science to inform practice, and we know how to structure opportunities for success. We just need to double down and be intentional about doing it so that every individual, including those with LD, because everyone benefits when people with LD benefit, everybody has the personalized opportunities that they need to be able to be successful.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. That's a great springboard. That question of intentionality. When it comes to disclosure, it seems like there may be ways to structure a learning experience through something like UDL, where that can be beneficial to all students, really, with or without disclosure. But when it comes to disclosure, and because of those two S's that you mentioned, stigma and shame, at the institutional level and in the workplace, it seems like it would then be incumbent upon those institutions to make it easy for students and employees to disclose. And so Gabrielle and Alicia, I'm curious to know, from an academic standpoint and from a corporate standpoint, what do you see is working in terms of fostering that environment where it's easy for a student to disclose, or made more easy through actions that the institution can take?
Alicia, why don't you go first and I'll follow up.
Have to get myself off mute first. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. So yeah, and I think, Sheldon hit the nail on the head, right? It's really about the stigma, right? When we look at different demographics, everyone covers, right? That's the term that we use when we talk about in our training that we do, unconscious bias. People cover because they're covering up a piece of themselves that they feel like may hinder, their progression. And so what we try to do, it's all about the environment. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued, respected, and the way that you are able to get the support that you need is by disclosing, right? But again, we know it's easier said than done. And so what we do at Centene is we try to create that environment where people feel like they can, share that information without any type of harm, right? And so a couple of ways that we do that, we have employee inclusion groups. And so some organizations may call them business resource groups or employee resource groups. We call ours employee inclusion groups, so EIGs for short. And one of our 5 groups is Ability, which is our disability network for people with disabilities and caregivers. And so this group is comprised of employees that have come together to say that we really want to attack the stigma, right, that goes along with disability. And so they create programming, they share stories, because the power of storytelling is key, right? So if I'm able to share my story, then someone else says, oh, wow, they shared their story, and this is how it worked out for them. So they create this programming, and we have that in place. They also, which is really great, last year in conjunction with the 30th anniversary of the Disability Act, our organization created the I Count campaign. And so really what this was about was giving people a chance to say, I count, right? And we did this by really allowing people to say, I have a disability, I'm a veteran, I identify as LGBTQ plus, or my gender identity. So we had all of these campaigns in place that were spearheaded by our EIGs. And again, it gave people a place to say, I count, right? This matters. And although this data is held close, right, it's not shared with people. But what we can do is we can collect that data and at an aggregate at a high level, we can use that information to inform strategy, right? What are the programming that we need to put in place to help support our employees? And what are those things that we need to ensure that people have in place so they feel comfortable stepping up, right? Part of that is training. We've created unconscious bias training. And so within our unconscious bias training, we talk about the blind spots that we all have, right? If you're human, you have unconscious bias, right? It's about what we've heard, what we've learned, what we've seen, and it may not align with who you are. We know vocally what you say, but deep down inside, what are those things that you've seen, right? That you've maybe put into place. And I share all the time about, especially with disability, right? Because we may not have a particular disability, we put barriers on people that don't exist, right? Just because I might not have this learning disability, or maybe I'm not blind, I don't know how to get the work done. It's not for us to decide that, right? If we got a resume and we saw that person has the experience and the skills that we need to then ensure that we're equipping them with all the successful tools that they need in order to do that job. And so one thing that we did a couple of years ago as an organization is we created a central accommodation process. And so that way we took it out of the hands of our various HR business partners and we put it in the hands of experts. We have an ADA team that is comprised of employees that are specific to the work. They reach out to our employees, they learn what their need is, and they ensure that they get the tools that they need in order to succeed. We actually shared that we also participate in the Disability Equality Index, which Alex shared. We've done that for a few years. And what's important, right? It's great to get the recognition, right? It's great to say that we're an employer, a best places to work for people with disability. But what's most important is what we've learned from these surveys and what we continue to change at our organization. One being, I remember completing the survey and reaching out to our talent attraction team and saying, hey, when we're sending out an interview request, do we ask if people need an accommodation? And they said, no. I said, well, why not? Can't we just add that? And they're like, yeah, you're right, right? And so these are things that we're able to learn and glean from these surveys that we complete. And so we did that, and I'm proud to say that actually Disability Equality Index reached out to us and wanted to spotlight our accommodation process as a best practice. And so this is why we do it, right? We want to do it so we can create this environment for all employees, right? And so if they don't feel comfortable sharing, we're losing out, right? Because we're not able to truly tap into their full talent and their full capacity. And so that's why it's important that we create this environment where people feel comfortable stepping up and saying, hey, you know what? I need this type of accommodation to ensure that I'm able to, do my job the way that it needs to be done. And so, again, it boils down to creating the environment, because if people don't feel safe, they won't disclose. Right. And so and we want to make sure that we're creating this environment where everyone feels safe, regardless if they're disclosing their disability status, LGBTQ plus, their veteran status, whatever it is. We want to ensure that we're creating an environment for everyone to feel safe and disclose. So just a few things that we're doing as an organization.
And that really highlights such an important point, Alicia, around disclosure, that it isn't, belonging isn't limited to disclosure. It really is, it's something that is cultural, and disclosure is a part of that, but that's right. Not all. And I think that feeds into, I know, Gabrielle, this is something that you and I have talked about in the past. Sure. For many students, disclosure can be functional in nature. It can be because I need accommodation, but it's also a facet of identity. And that's one of the reasons that creating the sense of belonging is so important, I think, especially at colleges and universities.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for having us. We're thrilled to be here. And I know one of my colleagues, Jennifer Hansen, is joining us. So I'm delighted to be here. And I love kind of coming last, because, we bridge the world of science and the world of work. The higher education space. And so, everything that everyone just heard, I see it and I raise it in the sense that there's yet another factor that's true for, if you sort of think of two subgroups, the 18 to 21-year-olds who generally go to brick and mortar universities, as well as those who may be working adults and or accessing higher education through Guild and other sources. And that's the developmental characteristics of human existence. Every one of us, when we were in our adolescence, late adolescence, and so wanted to be just like everybody else. And so in addition to that, another factor in that environment is there's this natural tendency that we all have to, I don't want to be that kid anymore that needs an IEP. I don't want to be that kid anymore that needs things. I got through high school, I'm in college, I'm done, right? This isn't going to be around me anymore, right? And so there's this developmental realization as well that it's essential to have the right environment and the right support. But all of the things that we've just been talking about, whether it's in the workplace or science, exists here in higher education. And so we see our role as really helping students to bridge that gap. And if we do our jobs correctly, students leave us. We have many 50 or so graduating on Friday who leave with the ability to the confidence to be able to know they don't have all the answers, but they know enough about themselves to be able to look at an environment, prioritize. Everything isn't a 10 out of 10. What's a priority? What do I need help with? What's my work priority? How do I connect to people like Alicia, that the subgroups, the smaller groups that can help me, like, just put one foot in front of the other, little success after little success. So the way that we do that is, it's also, as many on this call know, there are units at every university that focus on ensuring legal access, that, there's compliance with ADA and federal regulations, and that's sort of the baseline. The SALT Center is a little bit different. It goes above and beyond that, and we work directly with students. There are specialists who stay with a student for as long as they're here. Most of our students leave after the second year. They have the skills that they need, and they're good to go for their junior and senior years, or they stay with us all 4 years. But either way, there's one person to whom they can always connect, and they can talk about a professor that's driving them nuts, a roommate who's eating their food, I'm homesick, all of the other things that trip up students. And again, at the brick and mortar university, in a more online or working adult environment, it's all of those things you mentioned, Alex, the time poverty. Do I take care of my kids, or do I meet my college requirements? So it's different scenarios, but it's really the same issue. And what we do is just meet students where they are and help them get to the next step, and not do anything for them. A big difference between the K-12 world and colleges. We'll role play with them. We will help them strategize and problem solve, but we're not going to go talk to a professor for students. They're going to talk to the professor. We're not going to solve the problem for them. We're going to work through it with them and encourage and cajole. And if we have to do backflips down the mall, we'll do it. But students have to step up. Our mantra is, you got to show up and speak up. And if you do nothing else, somebody will help you move forward. But you have to take that step, and we have to really encourage you to do that. And I dare say that in Alicia's world and in other places, it's the same thing. A lot of it, I forget who said 90% of life is showing up. A lot of it is showing up and speaking up. And you can speak up when you have a safe environment, when there are people who are making decisions that understand. So anyway, I'm going off topic and I'm rambling, but the SALT Center has got someone that's helping them navigate real life content tutoring. And it doesn't matter if it's English 101 or art history 700 and whatever it is, and then counseling and psychological services, because none of this exists in a vacuum. There are just lots and lots of different pieces of that puzzle. And we're proud that we are working with Guild and others to make sure that all of our students, UA Online and others, have access to these same supports, so that when you hire University of Arizona students, Alicia, they will be, good to go. They'll be bearing down with you.
It's a great plug.
Yes, got to plug my school.
You brought up a really good point, Gabrielle, about many very good points, but one that I'm interested in exploring more that we encounter a lot with our working adult students, which is the desire to learn online. Online learning and asynchronous learning provides a lot of flexibility, and that can help students fit learning into their working schedules, but that can also sometimes limit the types of supports and services that students are able to access. So I'm curious to better understand what that experience really looks like for a student with learning disabilities who is learning online and may require some additional guidance or structure to achieve academic success.
Well, not to get too far in the weeds, but the brick and mortar university has a different cadence. It's actually a whole different unit. There's a 16-week semester, that sort of thing, where our online program is shorter 7-week segments. So we have courses that, the duration is shorter, the intensity of work is shorter. Therefore, we're going to adjust the kind of support that's provided, the financial structure, the cognitive and social emotional support, all of those things. And, a lot of it really just depends. It depends on the student, it depends on their program, it depends on a lot of things. So I hate to be vague about it, but our primary job, and actually Jennifer is leading this effort, is making those adjustments and achieving the same ends in that environment. But past that, a lot of it really just depends on the student needs, the class, the structure, all of those things. And so it is, as Sheldon said, it's all very individualized.
That makes a lot of sense. And I imagine, Alicia, when it comes to individual support, this can be rather challenging for a company as large as Centene Corporation. I mean, we're talking about a really large, complex environment with over, I think, 70,000 employees in many different locations. So you're never going to get everyone together into a company photo. And you talk a lot about the importance of addressing bias. And I'm curious to understand a little bit more about how you approach unconscious bias training in an environment that is so large. And how do you help prevent some employees with learning disabilities from slipping through the cracks here?
Yeah, great question. And so that's something as an organization we started doing a couple of years ago. To your point, it's really understanding and normalizing that the fact that we all have biases, right? And what's the issue is if you try to say you don't, right? And so you're trying to sweep things under the rug. And so really our training is about recognizing those blind spots and how they occur in all facets of our life. And most importantly, then how can it then affect your hiring? How does it affect who you're providing those stretch assignments to? How does it impact who you're promoting, performance reviews, all of that? And so we have a couple of ways that we do that. We have an e-learning module that we've created. And then also we have an instructor-led training, which is 2.5 hours. And so during that 2.5-hour training, it's really about having those conversations, allowing people to speak up and share their experiences, right? What are those microaggressions? One example that we give of a microaggression in our training is, you have a disability, you look perfectly normal to me, right? And so people say these things all the time, right? And so we do this training to not make people feel bad, right? But to make people understand the impact. And this is what I say all the time. Intention and impact are two totally different things. You may not have intended to offend someone, but it does not lessen the impact, and it does not take away the impact on that person. And so that's really what we try to stress throughout our training around what does that look like. And so what we've done is it's available for all of our employees, but we've made it mandatory for our people leaders. And so it's important for our people leaders to understand, what their responsibility is, and then how they then impact the entire organization. Because if they have hiring power, if they have the ability to make decisions on who's being promoted, they're impacting our workplace. And we say all the time with Centene, we service 1 in 15 Americans when it comes to their health care. That's a huge responsibility. And with that, we have a very diverse member population. And so we want to ensure that we are mirroring the population that we serve with our workforce. And so that's really what we try to stress in our training to all of our employees. Like I said, it's available to all of our employees, but it is mandatory for our people leader.
Amen. That is powerful. Sheldon, I am curious to know from your perspective and the research that you've done with National Center for Learning Disabilities, what are some specific services that you're seeing do tend to work well in supporting folks with learning disabilities as they're transitioning from college and university and into the workplace specifically?
I think there are a couple of really important variables to keep in mind, but it takes a willingness to think about a different kind of a model. So, for example, I'll use my son, who is an MBA student, has learning disabilities, has ADHD, did really well in college, did well in graduate school. But he was the kid who said, look, for me to be successful, here's what I need. And rather than his professor saying, well, that's not my problem, work it out, or, go to the Office of Disability Services and they'll give you the help. The professor said, all right, let's come up with a model that works for you and other people who may have unique challenges. And they decided to work in teams. So he, on his team, he did the modeling. He's in supply chain and operations. He did the modeling work. He created the ideas. Another person on his team created the PowerPoint. Another one did the narrative paper, and they all passed the course. And they did really well, and they're still friends. But the point is that they weren't forced into this model where everyone was doing their own thing, because it wasn't good for anybody. And it was especially not good for kids who needed that peer interaction. They needed someone else who had facility doing something better and easier, but they all learned and they all had to sign off on it. And so if that's the kind of thinking, the out-of-box thinking that we can promote in the workplace and in universities, we should be doing it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard students at NCLD, part of our scholarship programs, part of our young adult councils, they go to a professor and said, I never had a student with LD. It's not up to me. Go ahead and get the support you need from the Office of Disability Services, which happens to be across campus. It's a 20-minute walk, but I won't give you the paper or the reader material or whatever. They've got to walk, they've got to reschedule, they've got to come up with their own proctor. It's like, how many obstacles can you put in that person's place? And I don't think it's done intentionally. I just think it's not done thoughtfully, and it's not intuitive. And it's the kind of thing that we could be doing better at. Anyone who thinks about how they can support their students or their workers, and if they're not part of the solution, then they're part of the problem. And they're exacerbating opportunities for that person not to get what they need.
I love this idea of individuals working together to meet individual needs, and also finding ways to accommodate reasonably within a given context. And I think that's something that can be quite challenging for folks, and it can also be challenging to the act of disclosing itself. And I know, Sheldon and Gabrielle, this is something that we've mentioned before in previous conversations around preparedness to disclose in the workplace. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like, and how you help students get more comfortable with requesting accommodation and with disclosing?
I can talk a little bit about it. We know it's an individual experience. We have an event every year where alumni come back, Salt Center alumni come back and talk. And interestingly, the number one question they get is, did you disclose? And the number one answer is absolutely not. And the counsel that they receive is let your employer get to know you as a person before they see you as an ADA issue. Now, that's my rephrasing, of course. And, we wish that more companies were like Centene that really, really get it. I think in preparing students for it, it gets back to what we were talking about. We can't be with them forever. And there are great people in the world, and there are people that haven't become great yet. And they're going to interact with lots and lots of different people. So the stronger that we can get students to be, and the more that they understand about themselves, the better. So, to your point, Sheldon, we try to give a lot of professors and folks the benefit of the doubt. They don't understand that that accommodation doesn't diminish academic rigor. They sort of have this rigid mindset that if I do X, then I've diminished academic rigor. Same thing with corporations. That there may be leaders who feel like somehow I'm diminishing the expectations for my company. We're very fortunate at this university and many other universities to have leadership, the president of the university, the provost, people who are making decisions that recognize the diversity, and they really don't tolerate a lot of the kind of nonsense that you're talking about. They support as best they can. It's a big, complex organization, but there is a leadership commitment. So to answer your question, Alex, I'd say the stronger we help students feel as they leave, the more tools they get with the notion that they can call us anytime for their lives, and to identify employers and other connections that have that strong leadership. And you're going to hear it from people like Alicia, from their websites, from their social media. You're going to see that commitment and try to find those people that will support.
Yeah, Alex, I think that's so powerful, Gabrielle. And I think the other thing is, think about how powerful it would be if someone with a learning disability, trembling in their shoes as they enter this opportunity, and they want to make their way and they know they're qualified, but this is a new experience for them. Think about how empowering it would be for them to know, without having to ask, that their direct line supervisor or someone in the C-suite actually has a learning disability, and they were out. It was common knowledge. Just think about how, what a calming moment that might be, to know that someone in a position of influence in a company that you want to invest in gets it on a very personal level, right?
Yes.
I mean, somebody thinking of themselves as, maybe, advancing the corporate ladder, knowing that it's possible because somebody just like them has done it and sort of paved the way before them. I'm not suggesting everybody sort of, jump out and say, well, I have a learning disability, or I have ADHD, or I have this, or I have that. But it reminds me of another short story, and I can't help but talk about my kids. But two of my boys are adopted. And when he was in school, we did a family project, or they did a family project. And the teacher said, they were talking about family trees and history. And it said, does anybody know what adoption means? And one boy raised his hand and said, ooh, I'm adopted. And then my son raised his hand, ooh, I'm adopted. And then two others did. And the teacher looked around across this room and said, all right, everybody hands down, let's move on. But she had no idea that she was talking to kids who were living that adoption experience. What a missed opportunity for her to sort of use that in celebration of how families are made and how experiences enrich people's lives, and substitute adoption for learning disabilities in that conversation.
That is so powerful.
Think how wonderful that would be. And
yes.
There are affinity, Alicia talked about affinity groups, and these are being done in safe and respectful places. But can you imagine if it was actually a culture of the business place where those kinds of things could be celebrated?
Yes, I think that feeds in nicely to a question that we have from an audience member here, Alicia, who asks, what can companies do to reduce stress that students with learning disabilities face? And how can they encourage employees to get a degree when they're facing a lot of self-doubt?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really think it goes back to the ability to feel safe, right? Creating that environment where people feel like they can share, right? And I share a story sometimes, Sheldon, too. I had our chair of our executive D&I council. He mentioned one time that he had an executive assistant, and he said, you know what, this person is amazing sometimes. It's like she gets it, she's on it, but other times it's like she doesn't even hear what I'm saying. And so right when he was about to put her on a performance improvement plan, she came to him and said, Ed, it's something that I haven't shared with you. She was like, I'm deaf on my left ear. Wow. And so he was like, oh my God, right? And so the fact that then she stepped up and felt comfortable sharing that with him then of course now he can make sure that when he's passing her, he's talking to her on her right side, and they're able to, adjust the way that they interact with one another. So again, I just think it's the power of the person feeling comfortable sharing, and then that leader can then figure out how they can best support them in whatever their development plan may be, whether it's going back to school, whether it's transitioning to another department, but, you don't know what you don't know. And so if you don't share that, then the person can't help them to achieve whatever that goal may be for them.
Right. That's a great answer. I'm going to turn now that we have a few minutes left to the rest of the Q&A will be from audience members. We have a really interesting question here around diagnosis later in life. Kaylin writes, so many people are being diagnosed with some of these learning disabilities very late in their lives. How can we help students understand that there are certain challenges in education that may be linked to an LD, and that there are ways to learn strategies and find support?
I'll jump in, and I'm sure you'll have something to add, Sheldon. I think it gets back to the idea of metacognition, sort of understanding how you learn and what characteristics there are of learning. And ultimately, a diagnosis, the process of becoming diagnosed, ultimately all it does is help you understand, sort of put some context to how you interact with the world and what's making sense and what isn't making sense. And so, we often talk here that it's a little bit less about the diagnosis, although that label can be very, very helpful if you don't know. And there are a fair number of students for whom symptoms really don't sort of become an issue until they get to college or until later in life. So this is not uncommon at all. And, so I think it really is making sure that we help students get a really, if they're going to get a formal testing, get testing, because that testing provides a roadmap to understanding how you learn, what works, what doesn't work. I'm an old teacher from way back, and those psychological, you could tell a good psychologist for not, because that it was a roadmap to how to help a child learn and help them understand what they do and what they don't do. I will tell one other, I'll join in the storytelling super fast. I work with a professional athlete who just shared with the world that he has, and in this case, it's Asperger's, it's on the autism spectrum, but this is an incredible golfer, an incredible man. He beat Tiger Woods once, who is incredibly gifted in one area, but he's about my age. And he just now has come to the place where he can share. And there was a CEO that he was in a pro-am with who said, hey, that's me too. And so it's exactly what we're talking about. When people feel safe, they will get the help that they need, they get strong testing, and they start to surround themselves with people who can support them. So I think that's probably it's different versions of the same answer. It's about the environment. It's about getting the right information and the confidence to say, I need these supports and I need to be supported in this way, in this setting. And I could go on. I'll stop.
That makes perfect sense. And I think that as a great question to end on, someone asked, how can schools and companies work together to prepare and support students with learning disabilities so that transition into the workplace is easier?
Well, I'd say this is a great place to start, in groups like Guild facilitating conversations like this, for sure. But I, defer to Alicia.
No, I definitely agree. And I know when Alex came to me, I was like, oh, great, more resources, right? And this is something, we are working and striving to be best in class, right? But we have a long way to go. And so we're looking for ways that we can continue to grow, continue to source talent from all different avenues. So I think this is a great way to start that conversation and continue it.
One other thing that I know NCLD probably does too, and we do and others, but we've worked with companies before where we just come in and do a brown bag session. A pretty big percentage of your employees are parents of students who have learning and attention and developmental differences. So oftentimes companies can just ask NCLD or the University of Arizona or anyway, we're all glad to come in and do a brown bag just answer questions and connect. And so
Conversation. Let's have a conversation. Alicia, Gabrielle, Sheldon, thank you so much for sharing your stories and strategies to help us have this conversation around how we can support working adult learners with learning disabilities succeed. I learned so much and really appreciate the fantastic engagement that we've had from you and also from our wonderful attendees. Thank you all so much.
super fun.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
This was terrific.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank
Great
you.
questions from the participants too.
Hi, this is Kim from Ahead again, and I would just like to say a big thank you to Alex and Gabrielle and Alicia and Sheldon for sharing all their very informative thoughts and ideas. And as a reminder, a link to the recording to today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slides, will be posted on the same Ahead page that you accessed today to connect to this webinar. So with that, we'll also say thank you to our captioner, Heather, and take care. It was a great session. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.